Ladies and gentlemen, listen. There's something you need to understand deeply. When you're a completely destroyed narcissist, it's not just that things are going wrong in your life. No, it's that your entire framework for interpreting the world has collapsed in on itself like a dying star. And the tragedy is that you don't even realize it, because the mask has fused with your face. The first sign, you've lost the capacity for genuine humility. You see, when you can't admit you're wrong, ever, what that really means is that you're terrified of who you'd be if you weren't always right. You're clinging to a brittle identity made of illusions, and the moment someone challenges it, you crack like thin ice in spring, and that's not strength. That's spiritual weakness masquerading as confidence. Second, relationships. You destroy them one by one, and yet you always play the victim. Everyone else is the problem. You burn every bridge and then wonder why you're stranded. But deep down, you know. You know you're the common denominator in the wreckage. You just can't face it, because that would mean confronting the monstrous possibility that you are not the hero in your story, but the villain. Third, you manipulate, constantly. You twist words, you gaslight. You perform empathy, but you don't feel it. Not really. It's all a game of social chess, and every move is about winning admiration or avoiding accountability. But here's the rub. People see it, eventually. And when they walk away, you're left alone in the echo chamber of your own narrative. Fourth, your life lacks meaning, truly, not because there's none to be found, but because you've placed yourself at the center of the universe. And that's a terrible foundation for meaning. Meaning arises from responsibility, sacrifice, from the courage to serve something beyond yourself. But you're too busy sculpting your image to ever carry a cross. And fifth, and this is the most terrifying one, you're empty. You feel it late at night when the distractions fall away. That silence, that void, that's your soul knocking. It's asking, who are you really? And you don't have an answer because you've never built a real self. Only a fortress of mirrors. So stand up. Face the dragon voluntarily. Let it burn away the falsehoods, and from the ashes, become. A destroyed narcissist can't admit fault because doing so threatens the shaky foundation of their self-worth. Constant conflict and failed connections are signs that the narcissist is the common source of dysfunction. Narcissists use people as tools for validation, often faking empathy and twisting reality to avoid responsibility. True purpose comes from serving something larger than the self, not idolizing one's own image. Beneath the facade lies a spiritual void, one that only truth, responsibility, and transformation can fill. Want a short version of this formatted like a list for a post or slide? When you've lost the capacity for humility, it's not just a character flaw. It's a profound psychological wound, one that reveals itself through an inflated sense of certainty, constant defensiveness, and a desperate need to always appear right. But beneath that surface of superiority is a fragile, fractured identity that can't withstand the slightest criticism. And here's the terrifying part. The more you deny this, the more it owns you. Humility isn't weakness. It's not about groveling or self-deprecation. It's the willingness to accept that you are not omniscient, that you make mistakes, and that your current understanding is incomplete. But the destroyed narcissist cannot allow for that admission because their entire self-worth is propped up by the illusion of being exceptional, flawless, untouchable. Any crack in that illusion feels like death, not metaphorically, but psychologically. The ego treats it as an existential threat, so instead of bending, it calcifies, it doubles down, it lashes out. Think about it. When someone offers feedback or points out a flaw in your thinking, and your immediate response is anger, dismissal, or condescension, what does that say? It says your identity is too rigid, you haven't built a self that can grow, only one that must defend. You've armored your ego so completely that nothing can get in, not truth, not love, not change. You're playing a zero, some game where either you're right and strong or you're wrong and worthless. That's a false dichotomy, but it governs your every interaction. This lack of humility doesn't just damage your relationship with others, it severs your relationship with reality itself. You become incapable of learning. You don't evolve. You just collect evidence to support the version of yourself you want to believe in. That's not intelligence. That's intellectual narcissism. It's like living in a hall of mirrors. You're constantly reflecting yourself back to yourself and mistaking it for insight. But real growth begins when you step outside that loop and say, maybe I don't know, maybe there's more I haven't seen. The tragic irony is that people often adopt this rigid posture because, somewhere in their past, admitting fault was dangerous. Maybe they were punished for being wrong. Maybe love was conditional on being perfect. So they built a false self, polished, invulnerable, admired, and it worked for a time. They got praise, they got attention. But they also got hollow, because if the only version of yourself you allow the world to see is the perfect one, then no one ever sees you, and over time you don't see you either. This illusion of constant rightness leads to chronic isolation. People begin to distance themselves, they stop giving honest feedback, they walk on eggshells or vanish altogether, and the narcissist interprets this as confirmation of their uniqueness. They just don't understand me, but that's not understanding. They're avoiding the minefield. The truth is, people can't connect with someone who's always positioning themselves above the conversation. Humility is the bridge to human connection. Without it, all you have is performance. Now, let's talk about shame. Because shame is often what drives the denial. At the core of the destroyed narcissist is a deep hidden belief. If I am wrong, I am unlovable. If I fail, I am nothing. That's the lie that fuels the entire defense system. And that's why humility feels like annihilation. But what they don't realize is that only by confronting that shame, by letting go of the need to be seen as perfect, can they ever hope to experience real worth. Not the worth that comes from admiration, but the worth that comes from authenticity. To accept that you are flawed is not to collapse. It's to become real. It's to finally engage with the world as it is, not as you wish it were. It's to trade the burden of perfection for the freedom of growth. But you can't do that until you stop defending and start listening, until you stop posturing and start reflecting, until you stop needing to be right and start choosing to be honest. Because when you lack humility, you don't just lie to others. You lie to yourself. You rewrite history. You spin narratives that cast you as the victim or the genius. You suppress doubt, silence inner conflict, and build a false temple to your own image. And all the while, the real self, the vulnerable, uncertain, human self is buried deeper under the rubble, not destroyed, but buried, waiting for you to stop running and start digging. When you look around and all your relationships are fractured, when friends drift away, partners leave emotionally long before they walk out the door, and family stops engaging beyond what's absolutely necessary, that's not a coincidence. That's a pattern, and in the life of a completely destroyed narcissist, that pattern is often repeated with brutal precision. But instead of asking what role you might play in the chaos, you externalize everything. You become the perpetual victim of betrayal, misunderstanding, and unfair treatment, all while being blind to the trail of emotional wreckage left behind you. It starts subtly. You place unrealistic expectations on people, expecting them to reflect back the image you want to see in yourself. You want them to admire you, to validate you, to orbit around your emotional needs without asking too much in return. And at first, they might do it, especially if they care about you. They'll bend, they'll compromise. They'll try to keep the peace, but over time they begin to realize they're not being seen as people. They're being used as mirrors, and people can't live like that forever. What happens next is predictable. The more someone pushes for autonomy, the more you feel threatened. You interpret healthy boundaries as rejection. You accuse others of being cold or disloyal when, in reality, they're trying to preserve their own identity. But you can't tolerate that because deep down, you need constant emotional reinforcement to keep your own identity intact. So you sabotage, you provoke conflict, you guilt them, you test their loyalty again and again until the weight of your insecurity becomes unbearable and they leave, or they shut down, and then you tell yourself, see, everyone leaves, no one gets me. But it's not about being misunderstood. It's about refusing to understand yourself. One of the most destructive things about this dynamic is how much it distorts your perception of others. You start to see everyone as either with you or against you. Friends become threats the moment they challenge you. Partners become adversaries the moment they ask for emotional reciprocity. You begin to project your unresolved pain onto every person who tries to get close. You accuse them of the very behaviors you can't admit in yourself, and it feels justified, because in your mind you're just reacting to how unfair the world is being. But that's the delusion, you're not reacting. You're recreating, over and over. This is why destroyed narcissists often end up deeply lonely. Not because they lack charm or intelligence or value, but because they treat relationships like tools instead of living things. Real relationships require vulnerability, they require mutual accountability, they require the ability to say, I was wrong, I hurt you, I see that now, but those are words that feel like poison to someone who's built their entire self-worth on never being the one at fault. So instead, you twist the story. You paint the other person as ungrateful or emotionally unstable or impossible to please. Anything to avoid the searing realization that you were the one who pushed them away. And when this happens again and again, you stop seeing people as unique individuals. They just become echoes of your past disappointments. Every new relationship starts with the seed of suspicion already planted. You expect betrayal, so you control. You expect abandonment, so you test. You expect to be let down, so you create situations where disappointment is inevitable, and when it happens, it confirms your fears. But it also reaffirms your identity as the tragic, misunderstood soul, never realizing that you've engineered your own suffering to preserve a narrative that keeps you from ever having to change. People aren't perfect. They will fail you sometimes. That's part of the risk of love, of friendship, of being human. But the difference between someone who can grow and someone who's stuck in narcissistic ruin is this. The former sees failure as a moment to reflect, to reconnect, to rebuild. The latter uses it as another reason to retreat into pride and blame, so relationships become transactions, emotional depth becomes a liability, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, your world shrinks, not because others aren't worthy of trust, but because you've made trust impossible. You can't keep pointing fingers at the world without ever turning one inward. If every bridge is burned, you have to ask whether you're the one lighting the match. Because until you do, you'll keep living inside a story where you're always right, always wronged, and always alone. When manipulation becomes second nature, when it's the lens through which you relate to others, you're no longer engaging with people, you're maneuvering around them. You begin to see relationships not as sacred connections, but as strategic positions in a psychological game where the only objective is to maintain control, extract admiration, and avoid vulnerability. And in that game, empathy becomes a tool, not a truth. You learn to perform it, to mimic concern, to imitate care, because real empathy requires self-awareness, and you've long since traded that for the illusion of superiority. You start with subtle things, you exaggerate your achievements, you leave out your failures, you present curated slices of your life to elicit envy or praise. You speak in half-truths, crafting a narrative where you're always the misunderstood genius, the victim of others' incompetence or cruelty. And you do it so consistently that it no longer feels dishonest. It becomes your reality. You've internalized the manipulation so deeply that even when you're alone, you're still convincing yourself. And what's more dangerous, this manipulation isn't always overt. It's not always dramatic or theatrical. Sometimes it's as quiet as a sigh at the right moment, a calculated pause, a well-timed compliment designed to secure loyalty. You learn to read people quickly, not to understand them, but to size them up. What do they need to hear? What do they fear? How can you make yourself indispensable to them, so they won't question your flaws, so they won't walk away? You trade authenticity for influence, but influence gained without truth is hollow. It breaks down the moment real intimacy is required. Over time, those around you start to feel something's off. They might not be able to articulate it at first. But the inconsistency builds, the patterns emerge. They realize your kindness comes with strings attached. Your apologies are laced with subtle blame. Your support is conditional, transactional. It's only there so long as they play the role you've assigned them. The moment they step outside of that role, by challenging you, by expressing their own needs, you withdraw. Or worse, you punish them emotionally, using silence or guilt or sarcasm as weapons. This isn't connection. It's control, and you justify it by telling yourself that you're just protecting yourself, that others can't be trusted with the real you. But the irony is, you never give them the real you. You give them a projection, a character optimized for effect. You think you're being smart, being safe, but what you're actually doing is erasing your own humanity bit by bit, because the more you manipulate, the more you disconnect from your core. You forget what it feels like to be sincere, to be vulnerable, to be known. And that emptiness starts to grow. Because no matter how well you manipulate others into loving or admiring you, part of you knows. It's not you they're connecting with. It's the image, the role, the performance. So the more you win the game, the lonelier you become, because real love, real trust can't be manufactured, it can't be controlled. It has to be earned through truth, even when that truth is ugly, even when it humbles you. But a destroyed narcissist doesn't want humility. They want dominance in the arena of emotion, and that desire costs them everything. Eventually, the cracks begin to show. People call you out, they confront you. They ask for honesty, and when that happens, you don't respond with reflection. You deflect, you gaslight, you twist their words, you accuse them of being too sensitive, too needy, too emotional. You shift the focus so masterfully that even they start to wonder if they were wrong to begin with. But every time you do that, every time you manipulate instead of owning the moment, you drive a wedge deeper between you and the people who actually care. What's left after all this is a world full of fractured connections. People who used to believe in you but don't trust you anymore. People who wanted to love you but couldn't find anything real to hold onto. People who saw the potential in you but were exhausted by the games, and you're left with a shell of relationships, familiar faces who don't look at you the same way anymore. Or no faces at all. And still you might tell yourself the same tired story, that they were weak, that they didn't understand you, that you're better off without them. But if everyone leaves confused, hurt, or used, maybe the problem isn't them. Maybe it's the mask. Maybe it's time to stop orchestrating every conversation, stop calculating every word. Maybe it's time to tell the truth, not just to others, but to yourself, because there's no manipulation clever enough to replace what you lose when you never show up as who you truly are. When everything in your world is centered around you, your image, your desires, your pain, you cut yourself off from the very thing that gives life meaning. At first, it doesn't feel like a problem. In fact, it feels like freedom. You don't answer to anyone. You pursue your goals, your dreams, your gratification, and you tell yourself that this is what life is about. getting what you want, becoming who you imagine yourself to be. But what you don't realize is that self-centeredness, taken to its extreme, doesn't lead to fulfillment. It leads to emptiness, because meaning doesn't come from being adored or admired. It comes from serving something greater than yourself. You can chase validation for years. You can build a lifestyle, a reputation, a persona that looks impeccable from the outside, but it's all decoration, and deep down, some part of you knows that. You know that no matter how much praise you collect, it fades. You know that the applause dies down the moment you're out of sight, and so you keep feeding the machine, hoping the next achievement, the next relationship, the next post, the next compliment will finally be enough. But it never is, because you're not building on a foundation. You're floating in a sea of mirrors, each one reflecting a version of you that's curated, not real. When you live at the center of your own universe, everything becomes distorted. Other people stop being full human beings with needs and stories of their own. They become either props or threats. They either support your narrative or they challenge it. And if they challenge it, they're seen as enemies. That mindset doesn't allow for depth. It doesn't allow for intimacy. It doesn't allow for love in the real sense of the word, because love requires that you see the other person, not just how they make you feel or what they offer you, but who they actually are. And when you're only focused on yourself, you never look that far. This is why relationships fall apart, why goals, once achieved, feel hollow, why moments that should bring joy feel strangely muted. Because you're not connected to anything solid. You're orbiting your own ego, chasing purpose in your own shadow, and the tragedy is that you might even convince yourself that this is normal. You might look at others who seem content and assume they're just playing a different game, that they don't understand your depth or your struggle. But often, what they've understood, what you haven't, is that life becomes meaningful not when you are the most impressive person in the room, but when you take responsibility for something beyond yourself. Responsibility is terrifying if your identity is built on self-worship, because to truly take responsibility for a relationship, for a community, for a cause, you have to surrender the illusion that you are the center. You have to make space for others. You have to admit that you're not always right, that your desires are not always the highest priority, that your suffering is not the most important thing in every room you walk into. That's a hard pill to swallow when you've spent years curating a reality where you're the protagonist and everyone else is a supporting character. But it's also the only path forward. When you begin to serve something higher, whether it's a person you love, a child you raise, a truth you defend, or a craft you commit to, you start to experience the kind of meaning that admiration can never give you. Not fleeting satisfaction, but lasting purpose. Not surface-level pride, but deep-rooted value, and it doesn't come quickly. It's built brick by brick, through effort, through humility, through sacrifice. The destroyed narcissist resists sacrifice because they see it as weakness. They see serving others as a threat to their autonomy, their image, their control, but that's the great misunderstanding. Service doesn't diminish you, it grounds you. It gives your suffering context. It gives your victories weight. It transforms your life from a series of disconnected performances into a coherent, meaningful journey. You stop asking, "How do I look?" and start asking, "What am I contributing?" And that shift changes everything. You can only live in a self-made kingdom for so long before it becomes a prison. The walls may be built from admiration, achievement, or charm, but they still isolate you from the world as it really is. And the longer you wait to step outside, the harder it gets, because every day you spend worshiping your reflection is another day spent turning your back on the messy, beautiful, difficult reality where meaning actually lives. There's a moment, often in the quiet, when the noise fades, when there's no one left to impress, no argument to win, no mask to maintain, when the truth begins to surface and it doesn't shout, it whispers. It says something terrifying. You don't feel anything anymore, not in the way you used to, not in the way that makes you feel alive, connected, grounded. That's the inner emptiness. It's not sadness, not even depression in the traditional sense. It's a spiritual hollowness, the consequence of spending years constructing a self-image so meticulously that you forgot to build an actual self underneath it. You've performed strength for so long, you've forgotten what vulnerability feels like, and in doing so, you've cut yourself off from the very essence of being human. You've silenced doubt, buried fear, ignored pain, not because you're strong, but because you were terrified of what those things might say about you. So you put on armor, you play roles, you manipulate perception, but underneath it all, when the room is empty and the show's over, you can't escape that gnawing sense that something is missing, and you can't name it because you've spent so much time avoiding it. That hollowness begins to shape everything. Conversations feel forced, achievements feel meaningless, relationships feel shallow. You might still go through the motions. You smile, you work, you socialize, but it all feels like acting. Because the part of you that was supposed to feel joy, connection, awe, it's not accessible anymore. It's been walled off, sacrificed to the illusion of invulnerability. And the scariest part is that you don't even know how to access it again, because to do that would require you to admit that the way you've been living, the person you've convinced yourself you are, is not whole. So you distract yourself, you keep moving, you chase stimulation, new goals, new people, new experiences, anything to fill the void, but nothing sticks. It's all momentary relief. The high fades, the silence returns, and you're left staring into that empty space again. That's when resentment starts to build. You begin to blame the world. You think, why doesn't anything satisfy me? Why do people keep failing me? Why am I so disconnected? But the truth isn't out there. It's inside. You've lost the connection to your own soul, and nothing external can replace that. The tragedy is that you might even look like you have it all together. To others, you seem composed, successful, admired. They don't see the internal fracture. They don't see that every compliment bounces off a surface that no longer absorbs love. They don't see that you don't believe anything good about yourself unless it's echoed back to you. You've outsourced your self-worth to the reactions of others, and when they're not around to validate you, you shrink. That's not confidence. That's dependence dressed as dominance, and the longer you live this way, the deeper the emptiness sets in. It becomes the baseline of your experience. You start to normalize it. You stop expecting wonder or peace or intimacy. You tell yourself that life is about performance, not presence, about winning, not connecting, about being respected, not known, and slowly, without even realizing it, you trade every human emotion for control. But control doesn't feed the soul, it cages it. There's only one path back, and it's not grand or glamorous. It begins with honesty, brutal, raw, uncomfortable honesty. You have to admit what you've become. You have to acknowledge that the persona you've built, the one you defend so fiercely, has cost you your aliveness. You have to grieve the parts of yourself you silenced, the innocence, the awe, the sensitivity, the part of you that used to feel deeply before shame and pride taught you it was dangerous. And then, when you've stripped everything away, you begin again. You stop performing and start listening. You reach out without expecting to be adored. You tell the truth even when it costs you status. You let yourself feel even when it hurts. Because pain, at least, is real. And through that pain, something new begins to grow. Not a new identity to replace the old one, but a quiet, steady awareness of who you've always been, beneath the noise, beneath the masks, beneath the lies. That emptiness was never proof that you were broken. It was proof that your false self couldn't sustain you. And once you see that once you stop fearing the silence, you begin to understand what wholeness actually is. It's not perfection, it's presence. It's not control, it's connection. It's not being admired, it's being known and choosing to be known again and again, even when it's terrifying. So now you stand at a crossroads. On one side is the familiar path, the persona, the pride, the endless cycle of blame and image. It's seductive because it offers the illusion of power, but it's also the road to deeper isolation, to a life filled with noise but void of meaning. On the other side is something harder, quieter, and infinitely more human. It's the path of radical responsibility, of humility, of choosing to feel again even when it hurts. That path doesn't promise admiration. It offers transformation. And it begins the moment you stop running from yourself and start telling the truth. The truth is, you're not beyond saving, but you do have to let the false self die before something real can be born. And that choice, as always, is yours.